We're going to go ahead and start our mini lesson for chapter 8. And our standard of focus is RL 5.5. So we're going to be looking at how parts of a story or chapters fit together. So we're looking at the overall structure. Our objective for today is I can identify related parts of the text in order to explain how a series of chapters fit together. Now, we know we're reading a novel, and so we're going to be looking at chapters and paragraphs. So we're going to be looking at those things and determining how do they help create this overall story for us. So in order to determine how these pieces fit together, we need to look at the steps. So below I've listed the steps of for this objective or this standard. So the first thing you have to identify what you're looking at. Now, chapter stanzas are scenes, sometimes lines, paragraphs. All of these things, we have to determine what is it I'm looking at? How does this particular piece fit in? So if we're reading a novel, we're mainly going to be focused on chapters and paragraphs. So if we are looking at chapters, we're going to determine how does this single chapter fit into my overall story? So what information am I provided in this overall chapter? If I'm looking at paragraphs, I can pause, isolate a paragraph, and ask myself, what information am I given? But before I can do any of that, right, I need to identify what I'm looking at. And that's why this step 1 is here. What am I isolating? The chapter, the stanza, the scenes, the paragraph, and so on. Then step 2 is we're going to study several parts of the text. So even if I'm looking at, say, paragraph 2, I need to think about the other parts of the text and how they kind of fit together. And so I need to look at for different things. I need to look for similar ideas, titles, events, or messages that are repeated throughout the text. Is there a pattern to the way the text is organized? So maybe it follows a chronological order. Maybe I'm bouncing back and forth. Sometimes we have a shift in narrative, like when we read Wonder, right? The pattern to the way the text was organized was we would hear a series of events told by one character in the story. Then we would hear those same series of events told from a different character's perspective. And together we saw the bigger picture, right? We saw all of the different pieces, how they fit together and how things really happened. This story is a little bit different, right? In One Crazy Summer, we have a main narrator, and our narrator is Delphine. So the way this text is organized is we're learning from one narrator her experience in chronological order. So we're learning from the moment she left New York City, she flew to Oakland, and now we're living through her experiences in the order that they happen. So that's how this is organized. And so it's really important that you want to pay attention to that and identify that, because that might help me understand the way these events are playing out. Literary elements. Is there foreshadowing? So foreshadowing is where we're going to kind of get hints about what's going to happen. There are often universal foreshadowing techniques in movies and literature, and we'll talk about those in a following lesson. We also have flashbacks, which we're going to touch on today. Flashbacks, it's a literary element that allow me to get some more information about maybe my characters or a viewpoint or secondary characters or events. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper in just a minute on that. 3, explain how the parts connect to make an overall structure. So how do all these pieces fit together? I like to think of it like a puzzle, right? When I'm reading a book, I'm getting different pieces. And by the time I'm at the end of the story, I can kind of put them all together. I can see the big picture. And that's how a book is written. That's how passages are written, poems. So they all kind of form a larger picture. We talk about theme, they form that, they form lessons that my characters learn, and so on. So it's important to understand that. Some questions you can ask yourself, they're kind of similar to what we saw before. Is there a pattern of events or ideas? Does an idea or message develop over time? So is there an overarching theme here that the author wants me to know, and how is it developed? How is it developed as we read through the story? Does one part introduce an element in the next part? So we see that often, right? We're given a little piece at the end of one chapter. If we think about as we read the end of, I believe it was Mean Lady Ming, and we got to the end of that chapter, we kind of left off with these three mysterious men outside Cecile's door, all dressed in black, right? It kind of led me up to what's going to happen in For the People. So it introduces an element, and the Black Panthers, that's a huge element of this story. It introduced it to me, but I didn't actually get that developed until the following chapter. So that's an example of that. So those are some things that you can look at, you can ask yourself as you're trying to determine how the story fits together. So now we're going to move on to foreshadowing. Let me make this 100% here. There we go. So what is a flashback? We talked about that literary element. In this story, we are going to see, in this chapter, we are going to see Delphine have a flashback. And so we really need to talk about what a flashback is so that we can understand why the author is doing this. And she does this a lot throughout this book. So a flashback occurs when there is a pause in action. So a flashback occurs, whenever there is a pause in action. Meaning we stop the forward motion. We are now, let me make this a little bit bigger for you to see. There we go. We're going to stop what's happening, the forward motion of events. So we're in the present and things typically move forward, but we're going to stop. We're going to stop that forward motion, and the author instead is going to share something that has happened prior or in the past or before. So they're going to introduce me to something that happened before or prior to the current action. So we're going to pause. We're going to stop moving forward in the story, and we're going to actually look back in time. So flashbacks affect the story's sequence. And so we know a sequence of events, the order, the common order, so the chronological order. Maybe we're thinking about this story, we're in the present day. We're going to pause this sequence of events, and instead of telling you the next thing that happened, we're going to go back and tell you something that happened a long time ago, or maybe right before. So it pauses, it breaks up our plot's forward movement. So they break up the plot's forward movement to tell us about an event from the past. Okay, now this is something we see often, and now that I'm giving it a name, you're probably like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That happens all the time. It happens in movies. It happens in storytelling all the time. And this is what we refer to as a flashback, because we're flashing back in time. So a flashback provides us with this is really important. What is the purpose? It gives me additional information about characters. So it's giving me additional information about characters as well as conflict, right? So sometimes it will tell me why something's happening. Why is this a problem? Why are they angry? Why, when we talk about, think about a story we've already read in the past. We read August. We were often told about why things happened in the past tense. They were flashing back on their events. And when we look at this story, we're often given information about Cecile's past through Delphine's recollections or her memories of things that have happened whenever she was a young child. So just to review, a flashback is the pause in action. I hope you're writing this down, okay? It's a pause in action. And the author shares something that happened before what's currently happening, and it affects the story's sequence by breaking up the plot's forward movement until it is an event from the past. The purpose is that it's going to give us some additional information about the characters or conflict. Now, we have this special spot here where we're going to just list all the different purposes of a flashback. Why are they important? Well, they fill the reader in sometimes. They can tell us why a character feels a certain way about a situation. It can tell us why a character does what they do. In this instance, we know why the girls kind of have a bitter taste in their mouth for Cecile, especially Delphine, because Delphine, if you recall, she actually remembers her mother leaving. We are starting to understand why Big Ma has some ill feelings towards Cecile. These flashbacks help us learn a little bit more about these characters and their traits. And this is really important because remember, as we annotate and we read through a text, we're listening for that C because that's one of our genre-based thinking jobs. Who are my characters? Who are they as people? What are their traits? What do they like? Their hobbies and so on. So it's really important. It can also explain some motivations. That's also a genre-based thinking job. So it can fill me in and express some of these motivations. Why is a character doing what they do? A flashback can also explain some background. I just kind of said that, but I want you to write it down. It can explain some background to a conflict. So maybe there is leaving this story behind and we're just thinking maybe we're reading a story about people who don't really get along and we don't know why that is. It just starts off about people angry at each other. Oftentimes we watch movies that kind of start from the end. If we want to think about a movie, it starts from the end and we spend the entire movie trying to figure out how they ended up where they are through flashbacks. The story is explaining to us how this conflict happened. How did they end up where they are? So this happens in literature as well. So it's really important to note. I want you guys to be writing this down somewhere. You could take a screenshot, a picture, because this you're going to need to use for our quiz on Friday. We're going to be practicing with flashback throughout the week, okay? So hopefully you can pause this and write this down. The purpose of a flashback is to make a comparison. Okay? Sorry, my O sticks. Okay, so it's to make a comparison between the present action and something that happened in the past. Yeah, so sometimes it just wants to compare two things. So something that happened previously with what's going on now. Maybe they're similar. Maybe they want me to see the differences. So that is another purpose. This is another reason authors use. Now, how do they do it? We've already talked about Delphine giving us memories, but sometimes they use other techniques. And authors oftentimes give us these flashbacks through our characters' memories, like Delphine has done, through our characters' dreams. Sometimes they tell us the past told by characters, and this is something that happened throughout Wonder, right? The past was constantly told by new characters. And then lastly, this one here, an interruption by the author. And what I mean by that is sometimes the author will stop. Maybe the story is being told from a third person perspective, an omniscient perspective that's objective. So they're not actually in the story. Sometimes, if we're reading a story like that, the author will stop telling the story and then give you some information about the characters. So they'll stop and they'll explain to you why something is about to happen or why something occurred while stopping the narration of the story. So this would be an interruption by author. This happens. This isn't something we're going to see in this particular novel we're reading because the perspective is first person in this story. We have a narrator who is in the story. She's telling this entire story from her perspective. So we're not going to see the interruption by the author, but we are going to see memories, dreams, the past told by characters. We're going to see all of those other techniques throughout this book. So I'm going to fit this to the page so that you can see it and you can write down these things. Go ahead, pause right here, write it down, and then come back. And then you can move to the next video where we're going to begin annotating glass of water together.